In today's video, you're going to learn everything you need to know regarding specificity in CSS. So we're first going to talk about what it is, then we're going to get into how it works, and then I'm going to show you some different examples from the Mozilla Developer Network docs, really great documentation on how specificity works. And then we're also going to look at some live examples here of me styling some of this HTML right here. All right, so let's first start with what is specificity? Well, specificity is an algorithm used by the browser to determine what styles are going to be applied to an element. The algorithm will calculate the weight of a CSS selector to determine what styles from competing CSS declarations will be applied to an element. And if that sounds like a lot, let me describe it a little bit differently here. So if you have multiple styles being applied to the same element, the specificity algorithm will determine which style to actually apply to that element. So for example, let's say that you have two different CSS rules and both of them select an H1 element and you apply a color property to both of those. Well, the specificity algorithm, depending on what selector you use to apply that CSS rule or those styles to that element, it's going to determine which style to actually apply to that color property for that H1 element. Because there's kind of this collision here in your CSS rules in which you're trying to apply styles to that color property of the same H1 element. So the browser needs a way to determine which competing style to actually apply to that element. And this is what that specificity algorithm is used for, to apply different weights to these selectors for the element to determine what styles are going to be applied. So let's get a little bit deeper into how this works. So like I kind of alluded to, each selector within CSS will have its own weight when it comes to specificity. The more specific the selector is, the more weight it will hold in being applied to the element. And you can think about the specificity algorithm as a 3-column value of 3 different categories. So for your 3-column value here, you would have on the far left, this would be kind of the most specific. This would be things like IDs. And then in the next column, this would be still a little more specific, but not quite as specific as an ID. As an ID should be unique to each element on your page. You should only have one element with a certain ID, and those should be unique. So that should be a very specific selector. And that's going to hold quite a bit of weight when it comes to your specificity algorithm. And then in the middle, you have classes. And then on the far right, you just have a type. So for example, this would look like you just have an H1 selector. And this would look like you have an H1 with a class of title. And this ID would be an H1 with an ID of some ID. So the more specific your selectors get, the more weight they contain in the specificity algorithm. And these 3 columns are created by counting the number of selectors in each category. So let me show you some examples of this if this isn't making a ton of sense. I think learning this through example is definitely helpful because getting into some of that jargon there can be confusing if you haven't seen it. So let's go over to MDN here and look at some examples of this. So as I was talking about, it's going to give these kind of a 3-column value. And you have an ID column, a class column, and a type column. So for this ID column, you can see that it includes only ID selectors, such as using a hashtag, which is how you select an ID in CSS, and then some ID. And for each ID selector, you can think of that as adding a 1 to the far left column in your 3-column value for specificity. And then for the class column, this is going to include selectors as like .myClass, or an attribute selector is also going to follow into the class column, the middle column there, as it's a little bit more specific. And it's also going to include pseudo classes such as :hover, nth of type, required, and different things like that. And you can see that these will essentially add a value to the middle column of this weight value, or this 3-column weight value. And then on the far right, the least specific is just going to be the type column. So this is just going to include selecting things by tag, so P or H1 or TD, things like that. And it also includes pseudo elements, so : before, placeholder, and all other selectors with double colon notation. And you can think about this as adding a value to the far right of that 3-column weighting. And then you can see for a universal selector and the pseudo class : where, it's not actually going to add any weight to your specificity algorithm. That's going to remain 0, 0, 0. And then when you use combinators, it's also not going to add any value to a specific weight. So the plus sign, the arrow, the little tilde, I think that's what that's called, maybe. And those combinators are not going to add anything. And same thing with these selectors here. So these negation pseudo classes like : not. All right. Now let's go into some examples here of how this gets calculated. So in this example here, they are selecting an element right here with a ID of my element. And then they're also adding a class selector here, and they're adding that onto a tag selector. So since they're doing that, this is going to get a 3-column value here of 1, 1, 1, because they use an ID selector, they use this element selector, and then they also use this class selector. And then here in this second selector, they select an input with type password, so they use an attribute selector, and then they also use the pseudo class of required. So you have the attribute selector and the pseudo class selector, giving it 2 in the middle column. And then it also selects this input here. So that's going to give you the tag selector there. So 0, 2, and 1. And the key thing to know here is that anytime you have an ID selector, it is going to have precedence in being applied to an element over any class selectors or any tag selectors or anything like that. So if in this first example, if you only had this ID selector here, so the 3-column value is 1 -0 -0, that would still have precedence and get applied to a element over this selector here that has the 3-column value of 0 -2 -1, because this ID here automatically is going to precede any class selector combination or any tag selector combination. Any value further to the left will have precedence over values to the right in the columns. And another way some people like to think about this is on the far left, that basically gives a specificity of 100 points. So if you have one ID selector, that's 100 points. And then in the middle columns, that's basically giving a 10-point specificity value. So if you have one class, that would give you 10 points. 2 classes would be 20 points. But as you can see, if you just have one ID, that's still 100 points. That's still more than these class selectors here. And then a tag selector would just be like 1 point. So if we kind of use that thought process, this selector right here, it would give us 20 points for 2 class selectors and then 1 point for a tag selector. So 21 points here in this weighting. But this one right here, we would get 100 points for the ID selector. And even if it didn't have any class selectors or input selectors, it would still be applied to that element, even if these two were competing selectors here, because the ID is just going to hold more weight and have more precedence over even having multiple class selectors here. So hopefully that makes sense there. Let me know in the comments below if it doesn't, and I'll try to help you out a little bit more. So with this selector right here, you can see that we just use 4 different tag selectors. So HTML, body, main, input. And you can see that this gets the weighting of 0 -0 -4. Because we have 4 just type inputs here. So the far right column is going to get a 4. Now, one thing that's important to consider here is inline styles. And inline styles can be thought of adding a 4th column to this weighting comparison. I know it's like, right, you already gave us a 3-column comparison. And now we have to remember a 4th column. This 3-column stuff was already tricky enough. I know. But if you understand the 3-column, you should be able to understand the 4-column. So with inline styles, for example, adding a style is equal to font weight bold, and you just inline that within a element. So if we look at my HTML page here, if I had this input here and I just did style is equal to, and I added some style like that, that was not a color, but you get what I mean. If I added like the color blue there to this property, this inline style here, it effectively adds more specificity to an element. And that's going to be kind of pretty much the most specific that you can do. And it's going to be thought of as adding a 4th column here to your specificity algorithm. So if you had an inline style, it would basically add 1-0-0-0-0. So it's going to be a 4th column all the way to the left. And that's going to have precedence over anything that has an ID or anything that has a class or anything like that, because it is super specific. You inline that style to an element. So you can see it always overwrites normal styles that are authored in style sheets, and they can be thought of as having the highest specificity with a weight of 1-0-0-0. And the only way to override inline styles is using the explanation point important, which in general should probably be avoided as much as possible. All right. So let's look at some live examples of this. I already kind of showed you my HTML here, but just to show you a little bit more, and I'll show you the web browser output of this as well. So I have an H1 with code Ryan as the text, and then I have a div with a ID of my element, and then I have a few different inputs here in which I have an email input, and then I have another email input, and then I have a name input with a type of text. All right. And this isn't super important for you to like memorize this right now. Just know that I do have this HTML and we are going to be styling it. And if we go back to my web browser here, you can see that this is the output of it. It's already very beautifully styled. And I'm going to show you how these styles are getting applied here. So heading back to my code editor here, you can see that I kind of took from the MDN docs here their examples, and I'm going to show you how these work kind of live. So in this first selector here, I select the ID of my element, and then I select an input with a class of my class. So just like how I showed you earlier, that's going to have a weighting of 1-1-1. Or if you'd like to think about this in points, this would be 100 plus 10 plus 1 points. So 111 points. I try not to do public math, but sometimes I can't help it. All right. So if we go back to my HTML here, it's going to select my element. And then it's going to be an input with a class of my class. So you can see that it's going to select this input here that has a class of my class. And none of my other inputs have a class of my class. So I should expect this color red to just be applied to one of my styles here, which I do see that with this input, my text is red. Now here I select an input that is type email, and then I use a pseudo class of required. So it has to be a required input with a type email. And then since I use this tag selector or this type selector here of input, that's going to give me a 1 in the far right. And then I use an attribute selector, which is going to give me effectively a class selector here, so a point in the middle. And then here I use the required pseudo class, which is equivalent to a class selector here. So I get 0-2-2, or this can be thought of as 21 points. And then if I look at my web browser, you can see that that's going to select my middle input right here. And then for my final selector, I just have HTML body main input. So 4 different tag selectors. So that's going to get the weighting of 0-0-4, or just 4 points. And I'm setting that to the color of green, and you can see that that currently selects my last input. Now, let's play around with these just a little bit here and show you what happens when we change up the specificity. So in this top one here, let me change, instead of using this selector right here of my ID, let me change this to an attribute selector. So let me do ID is equal to my element. So a key thing to remember here is that I am no longer using an ID selector here. I am using an attribute selector for an ID, which is kind of confusing, but this changes the weighting from an ID selector to an attribute selector. So I no longer have a 1 in the far left column here, and an attribute selector, that's going to add a point to my middle column here. So that's going to add a 2 right here, and then everything else stays the same. So it's going to be 0, 2, 1. So that's now going to have the same weighting as this input right here. So what happens here when you have competing styles and they're both selecting an input? And let me go back and look at my HTML. So my first input here with the class of my class, that is also a required input. So this selector is still going to select my first input. So I have two competing styles here with the very same weight. Well, what's going to happen here is the last style being applied to the element is going to be the one that's applied to that element. This style is going to kind of cascade over this style here. So if I go back to my browser, you can now see that my HTML here, it is now blue because they have the same specificity weighting algorithm. But since my second selector is giving the color of blue, and that's the last selector that's being applied to this element, it is going to get precedence here. All right. So if there's a tie in specificity weighting, whatever's applied last to the element is going to be what gets precedence in getting applied. All right. So that is an example here of how specificity changes the styles being applied. And what if I change this to just a single input selector here for color blue? That's going to change my specificity here to 0-0-1. And as you can see, that has less specificity than this one here. So I would now expect this middle input to be green because my middle input, it doesn't have a class of my class. So it's not going to be selected by this first selector here. So even though this has specificity weighting precedence, it doesn't actually select my middle input. So that's not going to apply. But these both are going to hit my middle input here. But since this is now going to have more specificity weighting, we should see my middle input is now green, which we do indeed see. Now, there are some tricky things when handling CSS and specificity headaches. And in my next video, I'm going to cover that. So make sure you're subscribed for that coming up. Thanks for tuning into this, and I will see you in that next one.